The first thing that felt wrong was the car. Not the check, not the morning, the car. It sat crooked behind Theron's SUV when Thessaly turned onto his street-dark sedan, front tire halfway against the curb like whoever parked it arrived distracted or angry or too fast to care how the wheels landed. She slowed immediately, without understanding why her hands tightened around the steering wheel. Something inside her reacted before thought did. Not fear, older than fear. The kind of instinct that rises quietly in women who have lived long enough to know trouble rarely announces itself properly before it enters a house. For one brief second, she considered driving past without stopping. Then she saw Theron's SUV sitting in the driveway exactly where it always sat, and the feeling embarrassed her enough that she almost laughed at herself. Almost. The check was already written before the sun came up. $200,000. Thessaly Smith's handwriting. Corvell's good pen, the one she kept in the top drawer of his desk for 11 years, because throwing it away always felt too much like admitting certain parts of her life were finished permanently. She had stared at the check for nearly 10 minutes after signing it, not doubting it, respecting it. There is a difference. Money changes shape depending on the hands it enters. Thessaly learned that years ago, watching families tear themselves apart over inheritances smaller than this one. Love and wisdom were not always the same thing. She understood that now in ways younger women rarely do. But this morning, sitting in her kitchen before sunrise with early light spilling across the counter, the decision finally felt settled. Theron needed help growing the business, and she wanted to be the person who gave it. She was dressed by 6:15. Church clothes on a Tuesday because Thessaly always believed you should meet the day looking like you expected something good from it. Navy dress, good shoes. Pearl earrings Corvell bought for their 30th anniversary saved for days that mattered. This day mattered. 6 months earlier, Theron sat across from her at this same kitchen table, explaining distribution contracts, fleet expansion, trucking delays, warehouse costs. He spoke with the exhausted focus of a man trying to outrun pressure without letting anyone hear him breathing hard while he did it. She listened carefully. Then she told him she would think about it. What she really meant was, I need to know whether I'm helping you build something or helping you postpone collapse. Corvell would have said yes immediately. That man believed in their son with a stubbornness that occasionally irritated her during his lifetime and comforted her deeply after his death. She thought about him while folding the check into the envelope. 11 years gone, and she still caught herself preparing sentences for him inside her head. She finished her coffee and opened her voice memo to record her grocery list before she forgot it. Butter, the good orange juice, those crackers Theron liked as a little boy, that she still bought automatically, even though he was 43 years old now. The memo kept running after she set the phone on the passenger seat. She forgot about it completely by the time she backed out of the driveway with the envelope resting inside her purse. Atlanta was already warm. The kind of May morning that tricks people into believing the world is gentler than it really is. She has been on this channel long enough to know I do not tell short stories. Before we go any further, tell me what time you're watching from, because by the end of this story, that little detail may be the only calm thing either one of us remembers. By the time Thessaly reached Theron's neighborhood, the strange feeling from earlier had mostly faded, until she saw the car again. Dark, sudden, crooked. Engine still warm enough that heat shimmered faintly above the hood in the sunlight. Whoever arrived had not been there very long. She slowed to almost nothing. The house looked normal, too normal. Curtains open, no shouting, no movement visible through the front windows, just suburban stillness, sitting neatly under Georgia sunlight. And yet something deep in her body refused to relax. Not panic, recognition. Like some older survival instinct had noticed a shape her conscious mind had not fully seen yet. She almost kept driving. The thought crossed her mind suddenly and cleanly. Leave. Come back later. Then just as quickly she dismissed it. Because mothers ignore instincts all the time when those instincts point toward their children. That is one of the oldest tragedies on earth. She parked carefully along the curb, picked up her purse with the envelope inside, and stepped out into the morning heat. Then she started walking toward the house. I never made it to the door. Theron's front path runs alongside a low decorative fence separating his property from the shared access walkway between the houses. I had walked that route so many times over the years my body could probably have done it blindfolded. I remember every inch of it now. The exact place where the concrete changes shade beneath the tree cover, the loose fence post near the hydrangeas, the sound my heel made against the pavement right before I stopped moving entirely. I was still on the shared walkway, not yet on Theron's private path, when I heard Solange through the cracked front window. The window itself did not surprise me. Theron hated running air conditioning before afternoon. Corvell was the same way. Both of them believed electricity bills were personal attacks from the utility company. What frightened me was her voice. Not loud, low, compressed. The kind of voice that had already crossed a line emotionally and was no longer interested in pretending otherwise. "You already knew what this was," she said. My foot stopped mid-step. Not consciously. My body simply refused the next movement. Theron said something too low for me to fully catch. I heard pieces of it. Too far. Not supposed to. This wasn't... Solange cut straight across him. "Don't start acting different now," she said. "Not after everything." The air around me seemed to narrow suddenly. That is the closest description I can give it. Not spinning. Not dizziness. Worse, the feeling that the world has quietly shifted shape while you were still standing inside the old version of it. Theron's voice came back strained around the edges in a way I had not heard since he was 17, and lying badly about where he spent an entire Friday night. He said things had gotten out of control. He said this was never supposed to happen like this. Solange laughed once. A short sound. No warmth inside it at all. "You think panic changes what you agreed to?" Silence followed that. Not empty silence. The kind where two people suddenly realize they are no longer standing in exactly the same version of the truth anymore. I did not move closer to the window. That matters. I need that understood clearly, because later, lawyers and detectives and judges would all care very much about exactly where I was standing and exactly what I intentionally did or did not do. I stayed where I already was, frozen. And while I stood there trying unsuccessfully to force what I was hearing into some harmless explanation, my phone sat inside my open purse, still recording the grocery memo I forgot to stop in my car. The microphone was live. Everything drifting naturally through that cracked window was going directly into it. I would not fully understand the importance of that until later. At the time, I barely understood anything at all. 4 minutes and 11 seconds. That is how long the recording lasts between the word crackers on my grocery list and the moment my phone rang. In those 4 minutes, I heard enough to understand there had been some kind of plan involving money. Solange spoke about promises, about the split, about Theron trying to distance himself now that things had gone wrong. Not once did either of them sound confused about what the other person meant. That was the part that hollowed me out first. No shock. No misunderstanding. Only fracture. Like two people arguing inside something they had both already built together. Then I heard my own name. Not gently. Not as a mother. As a variably. That was the moment something cold moved fully through my body. 3 weeks earlier, Moselle mentioned she had started exploring Georgia wines. I had a bottle sitting untouched in my rack because my doctor warned me 4 months earlier to stop drinking due to my blood pressure. Before that, I drank wine often enough that everyone close to me knew I kept bottles in the house. So I gave one away. Simple as that. A warm gesture between women connected through family. Standing there outside my son's house, listening to tension move back and forth through that cracked window, a realization began forming slowly enough to feel almost merciful at first. Then, all at once, the bottle may not have been dangerous when it left my house, but somewhere after that it became something else. My legs went cold from the inside out. Then my phone rang. The sound nearly tore through me. I looked down at the unfamiliar number glowing across the screen while Solange's voice continued somewhere beyond the window. My thumb hovered over the answer button. And deep inside myself, before I consciously understood why, I knew my life had just divided itself into before and after. Then I answered. The voice on the other end was already hollowed out. Not crying. Past crying. The specific flatness of someone whose body has exhausted the energy grief requires and is now operating on something quieter and more permanent. "Miss Thessaly, it's Coralie, Moselle's youngest." I knew before she said another word. Something in her tone had already prepared my body before my mind caught up, and my hand tightened around the phone the way hands do when they are bracing for impact while still pretending impact might not come. Moselle was gone. Early that morning. Organ failure. The doctors said it moved frighteningly fast for a woman who had seemed healthy only weeks earlier. Coralie mentioned that Moselle had already been in and out of the hospital during the last few days. Confusion, exhaustion, symptoms doctors apparently struggled to explain quickly enough. Tests had already been ordered before she passed. Questions had already started forming around her decline long before anyone used the word homicide. Coralie was not calling to investigate anything. She had gone through her mother's recent call log searching for voices connected to the final weeks of her life, people who knew her. People who might say her name out loud the way family suddenly fears the world will stop saying it once somebody dies. She was grieving openly into the phone with anyone willing to hold the other end of it. That innocence, the complete lack of suspicion in her voice, made it worse than I have language for. I answered everything she asked. I told her Moselle was warm, thoughtful, that I had been glad to know her through Theron and Solange's marriage. I told her about the wine, about how she mentioned exploring Georgia Reds, and how I had a bottle untouched in my rack because my doctor warned me months earlier to stop drinking for my blood pressure. I heard myself explaining it, and every sentence sounded strange in my own ears now. Not guilty. Worse. Unwitting. Coralie thanked me softly. She said her mother spoke warmly about me. She said that mattered to her right now. I told her I was sorry for her loss, and I meant it in more ways than she would ever understand. I pray she never understands them fully. When the call ended, I sat in my car 2 streets from Theron's house, with the engine off while Atlanta moved around me like nothing inside the city had shifted at all. But something had shifted, because standing outside that cracked window minutes earlier, I realized something even more horrifying than the possibility that my son had participated in murder. Moselle may never have been the intended victim. I kept hearing Solange's voice. The wrong person drank it, not the wrong bottle. The wrong person. That sentence sat inside me differently now. I did not play the recording back immediately. I sat there honestly trying to construct another explanation for what I had heard. I turned it over from every possible angle, searching for some version of events that did not end with my son becoming a man capable of planning his own mother's death for inheritance money. I could not find one. I did not call the police, partly because I needed clarity before doing something irreversible. But the fuller truth, the one I could not yet say out loud, was simpler and uglier than that. Some part of me was still his mother, and mothers do terrible things sometimes in the name of hope. We delay. We rationalize. We wait for evidence that lets us keep loving our children without feeling foolish for it. I drove home. I placed my phone on the kitchen table and sat in Corvell's chair while the room slowly darkened around me. I did not turn on a single light. Late that night, I finally played the recording. Only once. When it ended, I sat perfectly still in the dark, listening again to one word Theron used that I had not fully understood while standing outside his house. Timeline. Not. This went too far. Not. This wasn't supposed to happen. Timeline. A man panicking in the moment does not use that word. A man who helped organize something does. And underneath that realization sat another one I could barely look at directly. If I had not stopped drinking 4 months earlier, Moselle Odom might still be alive. That thought stayed awake with me until morning. 6 days passed before I spoke to police. I need to say that plainly, because later, lawyers would ask about those 6 days carefully, and strangers would imagine they understood them more easily than they actually could. They were not 6 days of protecting murder. They were 6 days of a mother trying unsuccessfully to force reality into a shape she could survive living inside. There is a difference. I went to church that Wednesday and sat in my usual seat in the 3rd row and sang every hymn from memory while carrying something heavy enough to split my life cleanly into before and after. I went to the grocery store. I answered phone calls with the short, warm voice of a woman who sounded busy and ordinary and perfectly intact. I preserved the shape of my life because the shape itself was the only thing still holding me together. Inside that structure, I was waiting. At first I called it waiting for clarity. That was not true. I already had clarity. What I was really waiting for was rescue. Not legal rescue. Moral rescue. Some explanation large enough to rearrange what I heard into something survivable. I replayed Solange's words over and over, searching for alternate meanings I already knew did not exist. I asked myself whether "you poisoned her mother" could somehow mean something else entirely. I am not a foolish woman. I knew better. But love asks impossible questions long after intelligence has stopped participating. That is one of the cruelest things about loving your children deeply. Sometimes your heart keeps negotiating long after your mind has accepted the truth. I did not call police immediately because I understood exactly what the call would do once it existed. Theron would stop being reachable in the ordinary ways sons remain reachable to their mothers. He would become a subject, a suspect, potentially a defendant, and I would become something else too. Not mama. A witness. 43 years of memories, Little League games, graduation pictures. The night Corvell died, and Theron cried so hard he nearly made himself sick, all of it suddenly vulnerable to becoming evidentiary context inside conference rooms full of strangers. I understood what I heard. I was not naive, but understanding something and emotionally surviving the consequences of acting on it are two entirely different burdens. And for 6 days, I could not fully carry both at once. On the 4th day, I called him. I do not know why. Part of me says I needed to hear his voice again before destroying both our lives permanently. Another part of me thinks I was still giving him one final opportunity to sound human enough that I could keep doubting myself. He answered on the 2nd ring. Warm immediately. That frightened me more than panic would have. He asked whether I had been sleeping well, said I sounded tired. Then he started talking about a possible distribution contract in Savannah freight numbers, warehouse timing, delivery schedules, ordinary details. Specific details. The kind people naturally offer when they are relaxed enough to believe the world around them still functions normally. Nothing in his voice sounded broken. Nothing sounded hunted. Nothing sounded like a man standing near the edge of homicide. And that more than the argument outside the window, more than Coralie's hollowed-out grief on the phone, became the most frightening moment of my life. Because I realized then that my son could carry two versions of himself simultaneously without either one visibly touching the other. The businessman discussing logistics. The man connected somehow to a poisoned bottle of wine. And the seams between those selves were almost invisible over the phone. I stayed on the line 11 minutes. 11 full minutes listening to my son explain trucking routes while part of my mind quietly screamed beneath the conversation. At one point, I heard myself tell him the check was still coming. Even now, I cannot explain why I said it. Maybe habit. Maybe denial. Maybe some damaged maternal instinct still trying to hold normalcy together with shaking hands. He thanked me warmly. Said he loved me. Then we hung up. I sat at the kitchen table afterward, staring at my phone for a very long time. The recording still existed. The memory still existed. Nothing had changed. And yet hearing him speak normally destabilized me worse than the silence had. Because monsters are easier to surrender emotionally than sons. On the 6th day, I was standing in my kitchen rinsing out a coffee cup when I heard the knock. Not a neighbor's knock. Not uncertainty. A knock that arrived already knowing exactly where it intended to land. I dried my hands slowly before walking to the door. Something inside me already understood who stood outside before I opened it. 2 detectives waited on my porch. Professional. Unhurried. And looking at me with the particular focus investigators use when they are still deciding whether the person in front of them belongs inside the case or at the center of it. I invited them in because that is how I was raised. You open the door. You offer a seat. You do not leave people standing on your porch when they have come with something serious to say. My mother taught me that long before I was old enough to understand why manners matter most during difficult moments, and standing there looking at 2 detectives on my porch that Thursday morning, I stepped aside automatically and asked whether they wanted water. They did not want water. They wanted the kitchen table. I understood later why. Kitchen tables make people feel temporarily ordinary, safe enough to talk, cornered enough to reveal things they did not intend to reveal. The detectives arranged themselves carefully, one slightly forward, one slightly back, a geometry that looked casual until you realized it was not. They told me Moselle Odom's death had officially been reclassified as suspicious, pending full toxicology confirmation. The hospital had already raised concerns before she passed. Her organ failure progressed too strangely, too quickly. Certain abnormalities in her blood work apparently did not align cleanly with natural decline, and additional testing had already been underway before her death. Once she passed, the investigation widened immediately. Then they explained why they were sitting at my table. My fingerprints were on the wine bottle recovered from Moselle's home. I did not react because of course they were. The bottle came from my own rack. I personally carried it into her kitchen weeks earlier. I told them exactly that. The detective nearest me wrote something down without looking up. A neighbor 3 houses from Theron's property had reported hearing a disturbance the morning Moselle died. She could not make out the conversation itself, but remembered seeing a woman matching my description standing near the property for several minutes without approaching the door. I felt the air in the room change. Then came Coralie, still grieving, still speaking openly to officers the morning her mother died. She mentioned that the last meaningful gift Moselle received came from her son-in-law's mother. Coralie intended it as comfort, a warm, final memory. But grief does not control what paperwork becomes once police reports start moving between desks. The bottle, my fingerprints, the sighting, Coralie's statement. Separately, none of it meant much. Together, it created enough early suspicion that investigators felt obligated to eliminate me before moving forward. I answered every question calmly. I explained why I stopped drinking 4 months earlier after my doctor flagged my blood pressure. I explained why the wine remained untouched in my rack. I explained Moselle's interest in Georgia wines and why gifting her the bottle felt natural at the time. I told them about driving to Theron's house that morning. I told them I heard raised voices before reaching the door and decided to leave. Every word of it was true. I simply left one thing out: the recording. I told myself I needed legal counsel before handing over something that serious. That was partly true. But the fuller truth sat heavier than that. Even then, even sitting across from 2 detectives, carefully evaluating my face while discussing homicide, I was still trying to find a version of reality where my son was salvageable. I am ashamed of how long mothers can continue hoping after hope has already become unreasonable. They asked me to appear for formal questioning in 48 hours. I agreed. After they left, I stood alone in my kitchen staring at my phone on the table. I did not call a lawyer. I called Theron. He answered on the second ring. His voice arrived warm, immediately practiced warmth, effortless warmth, the kind that sounds loving because it has been rehearsed across a lifetime. I had mistaken that warmth for safety for 43 years, but underneath it, before the performance fully settled into place, I heard something else. Relief. Not relief that I was safe. Relief that I was the one calling him, meaning he had been waiting to find out who investigators reached first. And suddenly the room felt colder than it had when the detectives were sitting inside it. Atlanta does not gossip, it circulates. There is a difference. Gossip is loud and careless. What Atlanta does is quiet and surgical information moving through a community the way water moves through limestone, finding every crack, filling every space, leaving no surface untouched. By the time 2 days had passed since the detective sat at my kitchen table, my circle knew, not everything, but enough to have already started making decisions about me. Verdell called on a Wednesday morning. 22 years of friendship. She was the woman who sat with me the night Corvell died and did not say a single word for 3 hours because she understood that some grief does not need commentary. I picked up her call the way you pick up something familiar without thinking, without guarding yourself. The first few minutes were warm. How are you sleeping? Are you eating? The ordinary architecture of care between old friends. Then the questions shifted. She asked whether I had spoken to anyone about the wine. She asked it carefully. The way you ask something you have already decided matters. She asked whether the detectives had seemed satisfied when they left. She asked, and this was the one that landed, whether there was anything about the situation I was still trying to work through. Not anything I needed help with. Anything I was trying to work through. I answered everything she asked. I kept my voice level. I hung up and sat with what had just happened, which was that my closest friend of 22 years had called not to stand beside me, but to take a quiet measurement of whether I was someone she should be standing beside at all. She had not accused me. She had done something lonelier than that. She had audited me. The deacon called that afternoon, a man I had sat 3 rows behind for 11 years. His voice was full of pastoral warmth, and I could hear him choosing every word with care. He said it might be wise just temporarily, just until things clarified for me to step back from the building fund committee. He said the church community cared about me deeply. He said he wanted to protect me from unnecessary scrutiny. He was not protecting me. He was protecting the committee. I thanked him. I do not know how I thanked him with a steady voice, but I did, because that is what 67 years of keeping yourself together in front of people teaches you. I set the phone down and sat with the specific exhaustion of a woman whose reputation built over decades with her actual life, with her actual choices, was being quietly renegotiated in rooms she was not permitted to enter. Margaret did not call. She simply stopped making eye contact when we both went for our mail that morning. A small thing. The kind of small thing that lands like a stone dropped from a great height. I understood something that week that I will carry for the rest of my life. Innocence is not protection. Innocence is just a fact. What protects you is what the people around you choose to do with that fact. And the people around me were choosing caution. I could not fully blame them. That inability to blame them was the loneliest part of all. That evening, Theron called. Warm, as always. He asked how I was holding up. 4 words holding up that were just slightly too precise, too specific to what was actually happening. I answered normally. I said I was fine. I hung up. It was only after I set the phone down that I understood what the call had been. He was not checking on me. He was checking on how far I had gone. I picked the phone back up. This time I called a lawyer. The room smelled like recycled air and burnt coffee and the specific absence of comfort that only government buildings know how to produce. I had been in a lot of rooms in 67 years. Hospital rooms, courtrooms for jury duty twice. The room where they told me Corvell's heart had stopped. I know what it feels like to sit somewhere that was not designed for your ease. This room was that and something more. It was designed to make you feel that the walls already knew something about you that you had not yet admitted to yourself. Adrienne Price sat beside me. She had come recommended through my church's legal aid network, and she charged more than I expected, and she was worth every dollar of it. She had told me before we walked in exactly what to confirm, what to clarify, and what to say nothing about until she indicated otherwise. I had agreed. I intended to honor that agreement. The 2 detectives were the same ones who had come to my house. The lead one set a folder on the table and opened it without ceremony. His partner sat slightly back, the same geometry as before, and I recognized it now for what it was. They walked through the timeline. The wine, gifted 3 weeks before Moselle's death. My fingerprints on the bottle, which I had already explained. The neighbor's account of a woman standing near the property. Coralie's words to the responding officer, which had found their way into the official report and could not be taken back, regardless of how tenderly they had been meant. Then the lead detective paused. Not for effect, or not only for effect. The pause of a man who understood the weight of what he was about to place on the table. Preliminary toxicology had returned. A compound had been identified in Moselle's system, consistent with the organ failure that killed her. They were treating her death as a homicide. The word landed in the room and stayed there. He reached into the folder and slid a photograph across the table toward me. It was not what I had braced for. It was not clinical or graphic. It was Moselle at what looked like a birthday gathering. Yellow dress, head tilted back, laughing at something outside the frame. The kind of photograph that exists because someone loved the person in it enough to capture that exact moment. He placed it there deliberately. I understood why. He needed me to remember that this was a woman, not a case file, not a variable in an investigation. A woman who had laughed at birthday parties in a yellow dress and who was gone now, and who deserved whatever I had that could help explain why. I looked at that photograph for a long time. I thought about pulling that bottle from my rack, how I had held it by the neck, and thought about Moselle mentioning Georgia wines, and felt the simple pleasure of having something to give, how clean that moment had been. How completely it had been picked up by other hands and turned into something I still could not look at directly. Adrian's hand was on the table beside mine, not touching, close enough that I felt it. I looked at Moselle one more time. Then I unlocked my phone. I opened my voice memos. I found the file 4 minutes and 11 seconds, dated, time-stamped, and I placed the phone on the table between us and pressed play. The room went completely still. The detective leaned forward. 47 seconds in, he reached out and stopped it. He looked at me across the table. His voice was even and gave nothing away. "How long did you know about this before you came in?" I told him 6 days. The detective did not react dramatically when I said it. No raised voice, no visible judgment. He simply looked at me for a long moment, then wrote something inside the folder resting open on the table between us. His partner wrote something too. Neither explained what they were writing. I did not ask. By that point, I already understood something important about investigations. Silence is rarely empty inside those rooms. People are always deciding what kind of person they believe you are, even while nobody appears to be speaking. Adrian stepped in before the conversation drifted any further into dangerous territory. Measured, precise, controlled in the way she handled everything connected to that case. She clarified that familial shock after overhearing possible criminal conduct involving one's own child was not unusual psychologically, especially before toxicology officially confirmed homicide. She made it clear I ultimately preserved the recording intact, surrendered it voluntarily, and cooperated fully once legal counsel became involved. The detectives listened without interruption. One of them nodded slightly. Not agreement. Acknowledgement. There is a difference. Adrian walked me outside afterward into an Atlanta morning already beginning to heat under the sun. She told me quietly that I had done the right thing eventually. Eventually. Not immediately. I appreciated the honesty in that word more than comfort would have helped me. Then I sat in my car nearly 10 minutes before trusting my hands enough to drive home. The case accelerated after that. Just not in the direction I expected. 3 days later, Adrian called and told me Theron retained an attorney named Levon Greer. You can tell certain lawyers are expensive before anybody says numbers out loud. The confidence arrives first. Not arrogance exactly. Worse. The calmness of people, accustomed to pulling uncertainty apart professionally for a living. Adrian explained his filing once. Then again, because the first explanation slid straight past my mind without settling properly. Levon Greer was challenging the admissibility of the recording itself. His argument was straightforward. The conversation originated inside a private residence. I was not an active participant. And the recording captured communication between two individuals who reasonably believed they were speaking privately inside their own home. Under Georgia law, he argued, the recording potentially constituted unlawful eavesdropping regardless of whether I intended to capture it accidentally. 4 minutes and 11 seconds. The single most important thing separating me from suspicion. Being slowly pulled apart on procedural grounds by a man my son had clearly hired before investigators officially closed in around him. Adrian told me not to panic. Then, immediately explained why panic would have been understandable anyway. The motion did not automatically suppress the recording. There would be briefing first, arguments, likely hearings, judicial review. Weeks, possibly longer, before a final admissibility determination. Delay. And the way she said that word made it clear delay itself was dangerous. Every additional week gave Theron and Solange more time to reposition emotionally and legally. More time for memories to soften around the edges. More time for expensive attorneys to rearrange motive and perception carefully enough that uncertainty could begin replacing clarity. I sat alone in my kitchen afterward, forcing myself to examine what remained if the recording disappeared entirely. My fingerprints on the wine bottle. A witness placing a woman matching my description near Theron's property the morning everything collapsed. Corley's grieving statement about the gifted bottle now sitting permanently inside official police paperwork with my name attached to it. Nothing proving innocence outright. Everything vulnerable to patient reinterpretation. The letter arrived Thursday afternoon. Handwritten. That unsettled me more deeply than I expected. I recognized Theron's handwriting instantly. Mothers always do. School permission slips, birthday cards, grocery notes left on counters. 43 years of familiarity compressed into the shape of certain letters leaning slightly rightward across a page. He wrote that he loved me, that things were not what they appeared, that I needed to trust him. I read the letter 3 times, searching for my son somewhere inside it. The little boy who used to fall asleep against car windows during long drives, the teenager who cried openly at Corvell's funeral because grief still reached him honestly back then. I found his handwriting. I did not find him. I called Adrienne immediately afterward. I asked her one question. Does it matter exactly where I was standing when the recording happened? She went quiet. Not worried quiet, thinking quiet. Then she asked me to walk her through everything again carefully from the beginning. The fence, the shared walkway, the cracked window, the position of my purse, whether I intentionally activated the recording near the property, whether I moved closer once the argument started. I told her the truth exactly as it happened. The voice memo began in my kitchen before I ever left home. Grocery list, butter, orange juice, crackers. I forgot it was running entirely. I never approached the house intending to capture anything. And when Solange's voice first reached me through that open window, I was still standing in the common shared access walkway between the properties not on Theron's private path. Adrienne exhaled slowly after I finished. Then she said something that finally allowed the ground beneath me to feel slightly less unstable. The law cares about intent more than television makes people think, she said. You didn't trespass. You didn't hide equipment. You didn't secretly initiate a recording outside somebody's home. A conversation carried naturally through an open window into a common access area while a pre-existing recording accidentally captured it. Legally, those distinctions matter. For the first time in weeks, defeat loosened its grip on me slightly. Not relief, but the possibility of it. Adrienne told me to stay calm while the admissibility issue moved through the courts. I stayed calm for 4 hours. Then I opened my laptop. I want to be honest about that, because honesty was one of the only things left that still felt structurally sound inside my life by then. I was not researching. I was not gathering information responsibly. I was looking for a way to force the truth into public view before uncertainty swallowed me whole first. Fear makes some people reckless. Women my age tend to become methodical instead. That is more dangerous than people realize. I went into the Atlanta Journal-Constitution archives, searching old investigative bylines, not political spectacle, not celebrity scandals. I was looking for someone who understood the quieter corruption respectable families specialize in hiding. Money, inheritance, social reputation, the polished violence people commit behind beautiful front doors in neighborhoods with good landscaping. That is how I found Celestine Beaumont. I recognized several of her articles immediately after opening them. She wrote carefully, "No theatrical outrage, no feeding on grief to sound intelligent." The kind of reporter who understood that people reveal themselves more fully when you stop trying to perform outrage at them. I found her public contact information online. Then I opened a blank email. The first version I wrote was chaos. Theron, Zolange, Moselle, the wine, the recording, the inheritance split, the legal challenge, my fingerprints. Every terrible piece of it came pouring straight out of me onto the screen in one frightened, breathless wave. Then I stopped and read it back carefully, and immediately deleted every word, because what stared back at me was not truth. It was panic dressed up to resemble truth. The second version came slower, more controlled. I wrote around the edges instead of directly through the center, enough to suggest corruption existed, enough to imply evidence was being challenged procedurally, enough to communicate that an older woman was being quietly positioned inside suspicion, connected to a death she did not cause. I did not name Theron. I did not name Zolang. I did not mention the recording directly. But the shape of the situation was there if somebody intelligent looked hard enough. My finger hovered over the send button for nearly a full minute. Then my phone buzzed. Vardel. I almost ignored the call. Instead, I answered and listened, while 22 years of friendship shifted uneasily on the other end of the line. The conversation started warmly enough. How was I sleeping? Was I eating? Had the detectives contacted me again? Then the tone changed slightly, subtly, the way careful people change direction without wanting the movement itself noticed. She asked whether investigators seemed satisfied after my formal questioning. Satisfied. Not. Are you all right? Not. What do you need? Satisfied. I realized while she was speaking that she was not calling as a friend first anymore. She was auditing risk, trying to determine whether I was still someone safe to stand beside publicly. After we hung up, I stood at my kitchen window and saw my neighbor Margaret across the street collecting her mail. She looked directly at me, then immediately looked away. A tiny moment, a devastating one. That was when I fully understood something about cities like Atlanta. Reputation rarely collapses loudly there. It erodes quietly, through hesitation, through delayed callbacks, through people deciding they will wait before attaching themselves too confidently to your innocence. I turned back toward the laptop. My finger hovered over the send button again, and for several seconds, I seriously considered pressing it. Not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted oxygen. Public narratives create protection sometimes. Visibility makes certain people hesitate before quietly sacrificing you to preserve themselves. But then I thought about Moselle. The photograph investigators showed me kept returning unexpectedly at strange moments. Yellow dress, head tilted backward, laughing at something outside the frame. A woman who accepted a bottle of wine from me warmly and died because somebody else transformed that gesture into a weapon afterward. She deserved better than becoming the opening paragraph in a panic-driven media storm. And deeper than that, I realized something colder. Going public could damage the case itself. Levon Greer would weaponize publicity immediately. He would argue witness contamination, narrative bias, public pressure influencing investigative assumptions. He would claim investigators stopped following evidence and started following headlines. And worse than that, he might win parts of that argument. The very thing I wanted to use for protection could become the thing that fractured the prosecution badly enough for Theron and Solange to escape through procedural doubt later. I closed the email draft without sending it. Not deleted, just closed. That distinction mattered more than I liked admitting. Because some part of me still wanted the option available if things worsened. I sat motionless at the kitchen table long enough for the tea beside me to go cold untouched. Then eventually I called Adrienne. I told her carefully that I needed answers faster, because I could feel my patience becoming unstable in ways that frightened me. She did not judge me for that. She simply said she understood. Then she told me she would call in the morning. At exactly 7:43 the next day, my phone rang. Her voice sounded different immediately. Tighter, sharper, carrying something underneath it that had not been there before. Then she said, "I need you to tell me exactly where your feet were when that recording started." I told Adrienne exactly where I had been standing. The shared walkway between Theron's property and the neighbors. The low, decorative fence running alongside it. The fact that my foot had not yet crossed onto his private path when Solange's voice came through the cracked window. I had not approached the house intending to overhear anything. I had not hidden myself. I had not activated the recording there. I was still standing on common access ground with an envelope containing a $200,000 check in my purse when my life split open. I described every detail carefully: the fence to my left, the position of my foot mid-step, the distance between me and the start of Theron's private walkway. I had replayed that moment enough times by then that I could have sketched it from memory with my eyes closed. Adrienne stayed quiet after I finished. Not defeated quiet. Thinking quiet. Then she said, "That changes everything." She explained it in plain language, because Adrienne understood that frightened people do not need performance from lawyers. They need clarity. Georgia's eavesdropping laws, she explained, largely depend on intent and reasonable expectation of privacy. I was not trespassing. I was not secretly positioning myself to capture a conversation. The recording was already running accidentally before I even left my house. And the argument itself carried outward through an open window into a shared access area where voices could naturally be heard. "The conversation reached you," she said. "You didn't go hunting for it." That distinction mattered. A lot. Adrienne filed the counter-motion 2 days later. Levon Greer's challenge did not survive it. The recording was ruled admissible. When Adrienne called with the decision, I did not cry or celebrate. Relief is too simple a word for what I felt. Relief suggests the danger was imagined. This danger had been real every second of every day. What I felt instead was the sensation of unstable ground finally becoming solid beneath my feet again after weeks of trembling. But Adrian was not finished. While attorneys argued over the recording, investigators continued tracing the toxicology evidence independently. The compound identified in Moselle's system was highly specialized, not something purchased casually in stores or pharmacies. It came through a controlled online supplier that maintained transaction histories and shipping records. That trail led directly to Solange. The purchase occurred 11 weeks before Moselle died. The payment method traced back to a credit card in Solange's name. The shipment itself went to a private mailbox service in Decatur. Adrian explained investigators initially thought the mailbox showed sophistication. Later they realized it showed something else entirely: arrogance. Solange believed distance created invisibility. She apparently assumed shipping the compound somewhere other than her home address separated the purchase from her personally. But digital purchase histories, identification records tied to mailbox registration, and surveillance footage from pickup locations stitched the trail back together far more cleanly than she anticipated. The mailbox had been opened 6 months before Moselle's death. 6 months. I made Adrian repeat that number because my mind resisted the patience inside it. 6 months before anyone died, Solange had already established a private receiving address disconnected from her home. Not rage, not impulse, preparation. This thing had been built carefully over time. And suddenly, the argument I overheard outside Theron's house sounded different in my memory. Less like panic after a spontaneous disaster, and more like two people standing inside a collapsing structure they spent months constructing together. The digital trail never touched me. Not once. Adrian told me investigators were moving quickly now. Then she said something that settled into me strangely. They're separating them. I asked what she meant. She said investigators intentionally brought Solange in for questioning first without informing Theron beforehand. Not because police believed she was weaker. Because experienced investigators understand something important about couples who commit crimes together. The first fracture usually appears when one person starts believing the other may survive by sacrificing them. On Tuesday morning, they brought Solange in alone. And by Tuesday evening, the investigation no longer looked the same. I was not inside the interrogation room when Solange finally started unraveling. I will never know every question investigators asked her, or every silence they deliberately allowed to stretch across that table. What I know came later through Adrian, through investigative summaries, and through the charging documents filed 4 days after Solange was brought in for questioning. 14 pages. I sat alone at my kitchen table reading them on a Thursday evening, while Atlanta traffic moved faintly outside my windows like the rest of the city had not just shifted permanently beneath my feet. There is something brutal about seeing the collapse of people you love translated into legal language. Everything becomes colder there, cleaner, reduced to timelines and evidence chains and behavioral patterns. Investigators never directly told Solange that Theron had cooperated, because he had not. That mattered. What they did instead was more intelligent than that. They built pressure carefully around her and allowed fear to begin filling the empty spaces on its own. Certain questions were phrased as though details had already been independently verified elsewhere. Certain pauses lasted slightly too long. Certain assumptions were allowed to sit unanswered in the room long enough for Solange to start hearing implications that were never explicitly spoken aloud. The overall effect suggested one dangerous possibility without investigators ever needing to say it directly. Theron may already be protecting himself. Adrian later explained that experienced investigators rarely rush confrontations in cases involving couples or family conspiracies. They look for imbalance first, emotional fractures, fear asymmetry. The moment one person begins suspecting loyalty inside the partnership is no longer equal. That is where pressure becomes productive. Solange did not walk into questioning intending to confess cleanly. I need to be fair about that. She was not weak. She had apparently maintained composure through weeks of mounting scrutiny, toxicology findings, and investigative escalation without visibly collapsing. What destabilized her was isolation. By then, Theron had already begun emotionally retreating from the structure they built together. I recognized that pattern immediately once investigators described portions of her responses. He had started softening his own role internally long before police ever separated them physically. Distancing language, moral hesitation, emphasizing panic instead of participation. People do that when they are trying subconsciously to survive themselves before they survive the law, and Solange noticed it happening. That mattered too, because nothing angers co-conspirators more dangerously than realizing they may not suffer equally for the same decision. What eventually emerged during questioning was not a dramatic confession, no sudden collapse, no cinematic breakdown. What investigators documented instead were inconsistencies, emotional reactions, partial admissions, and angry statements that kept drifting dangerously close to the center of the truth before pulling themselves back at the last second. Sometimes that is more damaging than confession, because controlled people reveal themselves most clearly while attempting not to. Investigators noted repeatedly that Solange sounded less devastated by her mother's death than furious by the consequences surrounding it. That detail settled heavily inside me after I read it, because it meant Moselle had emotionally stopped being a mother inside this situation long before she physically stopped being alive. In several places, Solange referenced the timeline. That word again, timeline, the same word Theron used in the recording. Not grief language, planning language, the language of people managing sequences instead of emotions. She also referenced the split multiple times, never cleanly enough to stand alone as definitive proof, but consistently enough that investigators began connecting it to financial motives already developing elsewhere through inheritance records and digital evidence. Then came the statement investigators highlighted repeatedly throughout the report, not because it proved the entire case independently, because it aligned with everything else already forming around it. According to the summary, at one point during questioning, Solange became visibly angry and said, "My mother died and now he wants to act like this was all me. Not, I didn't do anything. Not, you're wrong." That distinction mattered enormously, because by then, investigators already possessed the recording, the toxicology trail, the controlled purchase history, the mailbox registration, the surveillance footage, and evidence that Theron had gradually started emotionally retreating after Moselle became the unintended victim instead of me. The pieces were no longer floating separately. They were beginning to lock together. Theron had not cooperated with police. He was still at home writing letters to his mother asking for trust. I sat with that realization for a long time after finishing the documents. Not vindicated, not triumphant, just tired. The kind of tired that settles into people after watching two human beings slowly dismantle each other using the same secrets they once trusted each other enough to build together, Adrienne called later that evening. Her voice carried that careful precision it always developed when she was preparing to place something heavy into another person's hands. She told me investigators expected arrests within 72 hours. Then she paused, and in that pause, I felt something shift emotionally inside the entire case. Until then, part of me had still been living unconsciously inside uncertainty, not innocence, not denial, just emotional suspension. But arrests make things real in ways investigations do not. Finally, Adrienne spoke again, quietly, carefully. "I need to prepare you for what the charges against your son are likely going to look like." I cleaned my house, not because it needed it, because my hands did. I started with the kitchen floor on my hands and knees the way my mother taught me, the way that requires your full body and leaves no space in your mind for anything running alongside it. I scrubbed the grout between the tiles with a brush Corvell had bought years ago for some project he never finished. I found it under the sink where it had always been, and I used it until my knees ached and the floor was cleaner than it had any reason to be. Then I cooked. A full dinner on a Thursday, collard greens, baked chicken, rice, cornbread, the kind of meal that takes hours and demands attention at every stage. I cooked all of it. I ate almost none of it. I put the rest in containers and stacked them in the refrigerator in the careful way you stack things when precision is the only control you have left over anything. Then I sat in Corvell's chair. I do not talk to empty chairs. I never have been that kind of woman, and I was not going to become her at 67. But I sat in it the way you sit in a place that still holds the shape of someone, the specific compression of the cushion, the angle of the armrests worn smooth by years of the same hands, and I let myself miss him. Not the managed missing I had been doing for 11 years, the kind you learn to carry without showing, the full weight of it, the kind that sits on your chest and does not apologize for being there. I thought about what he would have said. Not about Theron, I could not go there yet, but about me, about what I was sitting inside of. Corvell had a way of reducing unbearable things to their actual size without dismissing them. I needed that, and I did not have it, and I felt the absence of it more sharply than I had in a long time. Then I thought about every choice I made as his mother, the things I gave without being asked, the things I withheld because I told myself restraint was wisdom. The arguments I ended before they were finished because I could not bear the particular pain of conflict with someone I loved that much. The moments I looked at something in him that deserved a harder look and chose instead the most generous interpretation available, because love makes you a careless reader of the people you should be reading most carefully. I did not find the moment I went wrong. I looked for it methodically. Honestly, the way I have tried to do everything in my life, and I could not locate it. There was no single door I had left open, no single choice that explained what he became. What he became was built from more materials than just me. That is not absolution. It is just the truth, and the truth was what I had promised myself I would keep looking for regardless of where it landed. What I found instead of an answer was something quieter. Not forgiveness, I was not there yet and I did not pretend to be. Not acceptance either, something between them. An understanding that I had done the best I knew how to do with what I had and what I understood at the time. It did not make the 72 hours shorter. It made them survivable. I was in the kitchen on the morning of the 72nd hour when my phone rang from a number I did not recognize. I looked at it for one full ring before I answered. His voice came through before I had fully processed that it was him. "Mama, I have about 20 minutes before my lawyer gets here." He borrowed a neighbor's phone. I learned that afterward, and for reasons I still cannot fully explain, that detail stayed with me longer than larger things did. My son, the same boy who once sprinted the length of a football field under Friday night lights, while I screamed myself hoarse in freezing bleachers, borrowing a phone from a neighbor because his own life had become unstable. Enough that even simple things were no longer fully his. There is something inside that image I still cannot settle properly. He did not ask me for forgiveness. I was grateful for that. Forgiveness is not something exchanged cleanly inside 20 minutes on a borrowed phone. It is slower than that, more private. Some people spend entire lifetimes approaching it without ever arriving completely. Theron seemed to understand this instinctively. That surprised me. He talked. I listened. I did not interrupt because somewhere deep inside myself I understood this would probably be the last fully honest conversation we would ever have with each other. Once lawyers and courtrooms and formal defenses enter a thing, truth changes shape. It becomes managed, measured, rearranged for survival. But this call still belonged partly to the people we had once been before all of that. He started with the debt, more debt than I knew existed. He described contracts collapsing unexpectedly, investors tightening pressure, loan balances stacking quietly on top of each other until the business stopped feeling like something he was building and started feeling like something chasing him room to room. He spoke about it the way flood survivors describe rising water afterward, slowly at first, then all at once. I listened without rescuing him from any part of it. Then he spoke about Solange. Carefully, too carefully. Even then, some instinct inside him still wanted to position himself slightly outside the center of the damage. He said the idea started with her. He said he should have stopped things much earlier than he did. He said fear made him keep agreeing to conversations he already knew were wrong somewhere underneath himself. Not lies, exactly, but not complete honesty either. I noticed that, and I let him continue anyway. Then finally he said the one sentence I had needed to hear from him since this nightmare began. A woman died because I stayed quiet after I already knew things were going bad. Not polished remorse. Not self-pity. Not legal language. Just truth, stripped down enough to stand upright on its own. The silence afterward lasted several seconds. Then his voice lowered further, and he said something worse. "We always believed eventually you'd drink from that bottle." I closed my eyes. Not dramatically. My body simply shut them on its own. He kept talking quickly after that, like he understood stopping might destroy whatever fragile honesty he had finally managed to reach. He explained that before my doctor warned me about my blood pressure, I drank wine often enough that the habit felt predictable inside the house. When I unexpectedly gave the bottle to Moselle instead, panic entered everything. Not guilt first. Panic. That distinction mattered, because panic meant somewhere inside themselves they already understood exactly what they had created. He said after Moselle died, nothing between him and Solange stayed stable anymore. Every conversation became blame. Every silence became suspicion. They stopped trusting each other almost immediately after realizing the consequences were no longer theoretical. "The wrong person died," he said quietly, and after that everything started collapsing. For the first time during the call, he sounded genuinely frightened. Not frightened of prison, frightened of himself. That landed harder, because prison is external. But there is something uniquely terrible about hearing your child begin recognizing the shape of the person he allowed himself to become. I listened quietly, and while he spoke, I noticed something else that hurt, in a different way. Even now, discussing Moselle's death directly, he still avoided her name too often. He kept circling the tragedy, instead of fully standing inside it. A woman had died, but emotionally he still spoke about the event more naturally than the person. I filed that realization away silently, because I knew eventually it would matter to me more than it did in that moment. Near the end of the call, he went quiet for several seconds, the kind of silence people fall into when they are deciding whether honesty still serves any purpose anymore. Then he said, "You always made me feel like I was enough. I knew that. I just never figured out how to become somebody who deserved it." I did not answer immediately. What response exists for something like that? It did not erase anything. It did not redeem him. But I believed it was true. And true things without solutions are among the heaviest things people ever carry, because you cannot repair them cleanly, and you cannot completely throw them away either. I heard movement somewhere behind him. Ad door opening. Voices in the distance. Then he said my name. Not Mama. Tessely. The same way Corvell used to say it softly from another room, like my name belonged naturally inside his mouth. Then the call ended. I sat motionless for a long time afterward. Finally, I reached for my purse. The envelope was still inside exactly where I left it the morning I drove to Theron's house, believing I was arriving to help my son build a future instead of watching his life begin collapsing under the weight of what he had helped create. I picked up my keys. Then I drove to the only place I knew I needed to be. I went to church. Not for appearance, not for strategy. I understand how it might have looked. A woman whose name spent weeks moving through quiet suspicion, suddenly walking back into her church the morning arrests were expected. If I wanted performance, I would have called Verdell first and arranged something cleaner and more visible than truth usually is. I went because I needed to sit somewhere that knew me before any of this happened. Somewhere that still held the version of me that existed before the morning I drove to my son's house with a check in my purse and came back carrying something I never asked to survive. The drive took 11 minutes. I have made it hundreds of times, but that morning the road felt altered somehow. Not longer, not shorter, weighted differently. Like even the car understood this was not the same woman making the trip anymore. I sat in the parking lot for nearly 2 full minutes before going inside. Atlanta moves information the way rivers move under rock, quietly, persistently, finding every possible opening. By the time I stepped through those church doors, people already knew arrests were coming. They knew it was not me. Or at least most of them did. I need to be fair about that too. Not every face softened when I walked in. A few people still watched carefully, uncertainty lingering behind their expressions like something not fully settled yet. Suspicion leaves residue even after truth arrives. I understood that now in ways I never had before, but the room no longer looked at me like danger. That difference mattered. I felt the shift before I fully saw it, the atmosphere changing around me subtly, like temperature moving through a room after sunlight breaks past clouds. Verdell reached me first. She crossed the room quickly with the certainty of somebody who already decided what kind of person she intended to be before taking the first step. She took both my hands into hers and simply looked at me. No speeches, no explanations, no apology performed loudly enough for nearby ears. What her hands said was enough. I should have held these sooner. She knew it. I knew it. And standing there together knowing it was enough, the deacon stood on the opposite side of the sanctuary. The same man who called weeks earlier asking me to quietly step away from the building fund committee until things became clearer. He did not walk toward me now. He simply stood up from his seat the moment I entered and remained standing as I passed by him. In another setting, it would have meant nothing. Inside that church, it meant exactly what it needed to mean. Recognition. Correction. Respect. I walked to my usual seat in the third row and sat down slowly, folding my hands in my lap while the service moved around me the way water moves around, something that has chosen not to fight the current anymore. During the third hymn, something inside my chest finally loosened, not dramatically. No tears, no collapse, just release. The kind that happens after carrying tension so long your body stops recognizing the effort of holding it until suddenly it is gone. The arrests became public that afternoon. By evening, my name had begun moving through Atlanta differently. Not perfectly restored, not magically repaired overnight. Some people would always remember the suspicion before they remembered the truth. That is human nature. But through the same quiet channels where my reputation had been cautiously dismantled, something gentler had begun rebuilding it piece by piece. Not innocence. People already believed I was innocent. What returned to me was something else. Dignity. I drove home just before sunset. When I reached into my purse for my keys, my fingers brushed the envelope first. The check was still inside it. The phone was not on the kitchen table that night. The envelope was. I set it down when I came home from church without thinking much about it, not ceremonially, not dramatically. Just the absent movement of a tired woman finally placing something down after carrying it farther than it was ever supposed to travel. I hung up my coat. I stood at the sink and let water run across my hands longer than washing required. Then I sat down across from the envelope. Outside, Atlanta moved normally. That felt strange now. The world keeps operating with enormous confidence in its own continuity, even while individual lives quietly split apart inside it. I took the check out carefully and laid it flat on the table. $200,000. My handwriting, Corville's pen, made out to my son's company in the same careful script my mother used to say looked like I respected whatever I placed my name on. I stared at it for a long time, not because I was reconsidering anything, because grief sometimes requires witnesses, even if the only witness available is yourself. Earlier that afternoon, Adrian called with one final update before leaving me alone for the evening. Formal charges had been filed. Conspiracy. Financial fraud connected to inheritance manipulation. Homicide-related charges tied to the poisoning itself. Theron's business accounts were already under emergency review because investigators believed portions of the company debt may have overlapped with the financial motive they were building. Levon Greer was negotiating aggressively. Solange's attorney was reportedly exploring cooperation options. The case itself would continue for months, maybe longer. Real consequences move slower than television teaches people they should. I appreciated that slowness now. Fast justice usually belongs to stories. Real justice belongs to paperwork. After the call ended, I sat looking at the check and thought about the morning I wrote it, the kitchen full of soft early light, the quiet certainty I felt after months of consideration. The peace of believing generosity was finally about to land where it belonged. That feeling no longer existed. Not damaged. Not wounded. Gone. Some mornings become unreachable afterward because the person who originally lived them no longer fully exists in the same form. I thought about Moselle Odom, yellow dress, head tilted backward laughing at something outside the photograph. A woman who accepted a bottle of wine from me warmly and died because somebody else transformed that gesture into something lethal after it left my hands. I thought about Coralie's voice on the phone, hollowed out, exhausted, still reaching toward people connected to her mother because grief makes human beings search desperately for echoes of the person they lost. And I thought about 20 minutes on a borrowed phone. Theron's voice, the honesty buried unevenly inside it. The fear, the shame, the parts of him that still sounded like my son and the parts that no longer fully did. I believed him when he said I had always made him feel like he was enough. I also understood now that love cannot protect people from becoming dangerous versions of themselves if they spend enough time feeding the wrong hungers quietly. Both things were true simultaneously. That would take me a long time to fully learn how to live beside. I picked up the check, then I tore it slowly, not angrily. Anger had already burned through me weeks earlier and left something quieter behind afterward. Not performatively either. There was nobody in the kitchen except me, and I have never needed audiences for the moments that matter most. I tore it with the deliberate sadness of a woman finally releasing something she carried towards someone who had not been walking toward her with equal honesty in return. The paper separated cleanly. I laid the pieces on the table, looked at them for several seconds, then stopped looking. I put the kettle on, made myself tea, carried it to the window overlooking Cascade Road, and sat there while Atlanta continued being exactly what it always becomes in the evening: ordinary, steady, moving forward without consulting anyone's heartbreak first. The traffic lights changed. Headlights drifted past. Somewhere nearby a dog barked once and stopped. Life continuing normally used to feel comforting to me. Tonight it felt instructional, because survival is not dramatic most of the time. It is repetition, breathing, morning arriving again whether you are ready for it or not. What comes next for me will happen on my own terms, not for people who doubted me, not for church whispers, not for public sympathy, not even for punishment. For myself, for the woman I still recognized underneath everything fear and betrayal and grief tried to rearrange inside me. Some people believe surviving betrayal makes you stronger. That is not exactly true. What it really does is make you clearer. And clarity, I have learned, is the only revenge that continues meaning something after the noise finally dies.